Just to give a quick introduction to the Left Book Club while we wait for people to join. We are a subscription book club and not-for-profit initiative, and we want to foster a spirit of collective learning and political education. We want to create spaces where people can learn from each other and discuss radical ideas that can then inform the actions and practical steps we take to support the political struggles fighting for a better future for us all. Before we begin, I just wanted to draw your attention to a few helpful resources I've linked to in the chat. We think it is crucial that we have discussions like this today to develop our understanding of the current political moment. But we also believe that in times like this, it's really important to act, and we hope that these resources will have suggestions for everyone to help in ways that they're able to. So we're really thankful to David Austin for joining us today. David is the author of the award-winning book Fear of a Black Nation and editor of the collection Moving Against the System, the 1968 Congress of Black Writers, and the Making of Global Consciousness. David, thanks again for joining us.
No, it's my pleasure to be here. Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
So our topic of discussion today is race, class, and protest. The public execution of George Floyd has sparked visceral horror and mass protests in the US and around the world. Obviously, this is one more case in a long history of violence against Black communities and resistance against it. David, could you begin by speaking a bit on the different iterations that the Black Lives Matter movement has taken in the past few years, and how it builds upon a long history of similar struggles?
Yeah, sure. And well, I think the first thing to say is that our thoughts go out to the families of all the victims, both in the United States, of course, but also here in Canada and also in the UK. And, you know, yes, it's very true. I think that we're in a particular moment, a particular juncture. And we don't know yet, but something feels new and somewhat unusual about this moment compared to some of the other recent incidents and what it has sparked. And probably has to do with the convergence of phenomena, the COVID corona crisis on the one hand, people being quarantined, the impact that the COVID crisis has disproportionately had on people of color and people of African descent. The madness that is passing for politics in the White House and its implications not only in the United States but around the world. Then of course the public execution of an African-American civilian. I think the convergence of those things, you know, and particularly in the context of the corona crisis has led to this moment that, you know, I think the closest parallel that I can think of in recent memory, I mean, yes, Rodney King in the 90s, but folks have sort of spoken about the murder of Emmett Till. But so a window has been open, and we don't know how long that window will remain open, but it is a moment which has sparked conversation. I know from folks that I work with, including my partner who works in a union and is an economist, in unions, in, you know, almost every sector of society. If you're following sports, these conversations are happening in sports, in the sports world, amongst athletes and commentators, and of course in the realm of politics. So there's something about this window right now that's important for us to take advantage of, because folks are posing questions, not only about extrajudicial killings, but about the very fundamental nature of the structure of the society and the world that we live in terms of politics and And I would even say, especially in terms of economics, even though the economic question is not being sort of spoken about explicitly, not necessarily. So this moment, I think, brings us back to an old question that W.E.B. Du Bois posed in the early 1900s. How does it feel to be a problem? Of course, he was referring to the problem of post-emancipation, the period in the aftermath of slavery, right, in which slaves, people of African descent, were emancipated, but remained in a state of unfreedom. And of course, that was in the early 1900s and the post-1860s emancipation period in the United States, but it also speaks to the same problem. You know, what Sylvia Winter and others have referred to the plantation to plot problem in the post-emancipation period in other parts of the Americas, including the Caribbean. You know, what does a society, or what do these societies do with a population that was once responsible for producing surplus labor, right, as slaves, but in the post-emancipation period have become a surplus or superfluous population? And of course, what we know is that part of the response to that question has been mass migration has been part of it. Yes, that is true. And we saw the mass migration, various periods of mass migration from the south to the north, the southern United States to the northern United States, from the Caribbean to the UK, and from parts of the Caribbean to Canada and the United States, in search of opportunities and in search of human possibilities. But we know the other answer to that has been what I refer to as the plantation to plant to prison pipeline, right? The building of penitentiaries and the housing of this quote unquote surplus population of people of African descent in prisons, right? And now it's reached that extra layer in which prisons are now being used as a place of labor, right? A source of cheap labor. So in some respects, we've come full circle in terms of the problem that Du Bois, or the question that Du Bois posed in the early 1900s. And we're seeing in some respects, not only the plantation to plant to prison pipeline, but what I've also referred to elsewhere as the kind of Motown to ghost town problem, right? Inner cities in the United States that have been basically gutted of resources, and you know, the absence of jobs, right? And what we find in, you know, in these cities are just absolute neglect by the state, right? And of course, this is fueled resentment, it's fueled all of these problems. But then I mentioned Motown especially because, as you know, Motown, or Detroit, sorry, what I'm referring to as Motown, Detroit was the home of the major automobile industry, right? And as a city that had a large Black population, one of the things that sort of crystallized this for me and struck me some years ago, I watched this film, maybe about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, called Finally Got the News, a film that was produced by the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit. And of course, the League came into being in part to deal with institutional systemic forms of racism, but particularly in relation to the American labor movement, which excluded Black laborers in terms of representation, right? And what we saw within the League, which was part and parcel of the wider sort of civil rights transition to Black power movement, is that the League ended up making more revolutionary political demands, more institutional demands, right, than their white counterparts in the labor movement, right? So all of this is a way of saying is that, you know, it's important that we situate what we're talking about within a kind of historical context and a political context. And there's a way of thinking about the League, the 1960s Black Power civil rights movement, organizations like the Black Panther Party. You can talk about groups in the 70s and 80s in the UK, like Race Today, for example, right? As organizations and groups that came into being in that period to kind of address concerns that, yes, were tied to race, right? But were part and parcel of an entirety or a totality of questions that were also tied to class, the function of power, and the ways in which race and class are intertwined, that have separated historically white workers from Black workers, excluded Black folks, and even excluded Black folks from even the category of labor. particularly in a context in which, more universally speaking, and in relation to the white left, that labor, the category of labor has been so crucial, right? Because when we think about the left and we think about labor, right? The notion or the idea has been that it's workers that are going to be at the forefront of pushing for social change. But what we found is that like Black folks, workers and non-workers, whether they fit in with that category or not, have been at the forefront for these movements, but have often been sidelined and pushed aside, right? But in moments like this, similar to moments in the 1960s, we see this explosion in which people are making claims, raising questions about the nature of the state, the nature of power. I mean, it's almost inconceivable that even just 3 weeks ago, never mind 3 years ago, that in a public forum and in the media, there could be questions raised about, not only raised about the actions of the police, but conversations about defunding the police or eliminating the police, right? So clearly, and we see representatives of the state responding to that question. So clearly it has some resonance in terms of thinking about how institutional power functions.
Great, thanks, David. So just a reminder to our audience, if you do have any questions or points to raise, please do so in the chat. David, related to what you've said there, there's this long history of Black radicals highlighting that racism isn't just an interpersonal issue or a problem of attitude, but is instead deeply embedded in North America's and of course the UK's institutions. We know that, as you said, the genesis of modern capitalism is inextricably bound with the exploitation of slave labor. Could you speak a bit more on the development of this racial capitalism in the last few decades, and particularly, you mentioned this a few minutes ago, but particularly how we can understand what's happening today in the context of attacks on public services and welfare programs that intensified in the Thatcher-Reagan period, which continued to disproportionately affect Black and minority ethnic communities?
Sure. Well, I guess part of what I'm hinting at, and just to go back a little bit, is that, you know, we've lived with this false division. And again, I'm bringing it back to the question of labor, and you relate to, obviously, to the history of capitalism, is that, you know, when we talk about the history of slavery and the history of slave revolts, right, there's a way that we can think about slavery and revolts against slavery as being both a constituent part of what we call capitalism, right? A constituent part of it, but also constitutive of it. And what I mean by that is that, you know, we use this language of slavery and labor, right, in a Western European context, right? And ignoring the obvious that slaves were labor, right? And that division has been passed down through the generations in ways that has basically excised or negated the lived experience of slaves, both during slavery and in the post-emancipation period. So in our context today, the protests and movements of people of African descent around the world, right, have largely been excluded from that conversation. And there's a need to kind of bring Black struggles for change back into the conversation as struggles against racism, but understanding that racism, again, is a constituent part of what we refer to as capitalism. You know, I mean, the question you pose about the welfare state, as you well know, the welfare state came into being, right, in various different historical periods around the world, right, largely as a way of sort of reforming capitalism, right. When it became obvious that there was a certain sort of minimum requirement in terms of economic output or economic means that ordinary citizens need to be able to have at their disposal, right, in order to consume, in order to survive, in order to keep this machine running. But what we've seen in our immediate sort of neoliberal phase of capitalism, right? Right. We see that rather than we've seen cuts to those programs, right? In part because in part because of this calculus that suggests that in the absence of those programs, right, there's a certain sector of society that can be completely excluded, right? There's another sector, kind of lower class, lower middle class sector, right, that can be sort of mired in debt, right, and still consume and still contribute to the system, right? So just to kind of bring that concretely in terms of how that's manifested itself today, and I'll use the example here in Montreal and here in Canada, we see that like historically, neighborhoods that have large numbers of people of African descent and also immigrants and descendants of immigrants, right, have been disproportionately affected. I know the same is true in the UK, have been disproportionately affected by the COVID crisis. Why? Because first of all, they find themselves in lower paying jobs, right? Despite the fact that in some instances they may be more highly educated than their white counterpart. And also, as a result of low paying jobs, they find themselves in neighborhoods where there's an absence of social housing, an absence of affordable housing, right? And proportionally speaking, there are larger numbers of people living in individual homes in specific neighborhoods. Now, in the media, those neighborhoods have been pathologized because the data has been used to kind of talk about those neighborhoods as being almost like infested with the coronavirus, right? But without having a conversation of why economically speaking, Black folks, immigrants, people of color find themselves disproportionately in housing that has in some cases twice, 3 times the number of people on average than other homes, right? So clearly this is tied to kind of economic considerations in our context. So so again, it's important that when we talk about, because we talk about racial discrimination and we talk about almost in interpersonal ways, that is absolutely true, right? But here we're talking about the economic underpinning of the society, which again goes back to the Du Boisian problem. Large numbers of people of African descent from the Caribbean, from the African continent, in the 60s and 70s were encouraged to migrate here, even though they faced racial discrimination, because there were jobs, including cheap labor jobs, that needed to be filled. Right? But of course, while that labor was welcomed, right, their physical presence was not, right? So we're left with this kind of conflict and tension, right? The need for this labor, which is often, in many instances, precarious labor that kind of comes and goes, right? But in terms of how people of African descent, Arabs, and we haven't even got to the conversation about indigenous peoples, right? Their presence itself is not wanted, and it's an unfolding tension that we see playing itself out within the North American context, right? Again, what do you do with this surplus population? And if we just add to that in terms of the kind of labor specifically that women. Women of African descent are doing, many of them in the caring industry. So they're working in some of these nursing homes, which, I'm not sure if you've been following it, but in the Quebec context, like large numbers of the elderly have passed away as a result of the COVID crisis. But the other consequence of that is that people working in those industries, and as I said, many of them are women of African, Afro-Caribbean origin or African origin, have been affected by the virus, and also not only, of course, they're not individually affected themselves, but the virus has been brought back to those communities, right? But in an absence of an understanding what circumstances, political economic circumstances have led to that, right? It's almost as if the virus is part and parcel of the lives and being of the people that have been most impacted. And we see that here in Montreal, we see that in Toronto, we see that in Nova Scotia, and of course we see it in the United States. New York, which is just across the border from where I'm living, that's been an inherent part of the conversation. The absence of talking about the kind of structural inequalities and structural injustice has led to conversations as if, like, look at how these people live, almost as if it's inherent to their culture and being.
Mhm. Thanks, David. So while there are specificities in the US context, race and policing are obviously global issues, and we know that many states around the world are deeply implicated in institutional racism and the violence that stems from it. Protests in the US have sparked protests around the globe today. Um, in your book, Moving Against the System, you mention the work of Richard Eiton, who wrote about the possibility of challenging racialized exclusion and domination from within the nation state while transcending its boundaries and limitations. I wondered if you could comment on the disruptive political possibilities that transnational solidarity presents in moments like this.
Well, I think part of what Richard was doing, I mean, Richard did a number of things. So there's a book, In Search of the Black Fantastic, but I also just want to mention a book that he wrote before that called Solidarity Blues. It's an important book because it documents the ways in which historically race has been like a crucial point in terms of a crucial barrier to Black, white, or interracial solidarity in the United States. And was in part his way of explaining why there has not been a genuine, even though there's conversation about socialism in the United States today, there's never been a genuine, widespread, broad socialist movement in the United States because race has been that barrier. So we can talk about Black socialists, folks within the Black radical tradition of push for socialists, but there's always been that barrier that has separated the Black radical tradition of Black radical movements, some of which were pushing for socialism from the white left. Right? In Solidarity Blues, he takes that conversation a little bit further, in part by talking about the meaning of diasporic politics. Right? So he talks about how through popular culture and other sort of and political movements, right? He focuses on popular culture, but he's talking about politics in general. How, you know, we can think about politics in two ways. Like the ways in which people politically make demands upon the state for change, which what we're seeing today, reforming the police, right? Changes to certain, you know, ways in which the system can be reformed, right, within the context of what it means to be a citizen, right? But of course, those demands have certain limitations within the structure itself, including the fact that often when those demands are being made, they're being made within the context of a state or within state structures that sort of reproduce forms of state nationalism, right? So what Richard was trying to get us to think about is how do you think beyond those boundaries and how do you think beyond those barriers? And one of the things that he pointed to was the fact that by virtue of experience, the fact that people of African descent are largely a diasporic people. We can speak about people living in some part of Canada and also in the Caribbean. And that's been part of the kind of, not only the sense of movement in terms of migration for economic and social reasons, right? But also in terms of politics, right? Black internationalism in the 1960s speaks to that, right? You think about a figure like Stokely Carmichael, born in Trinidad, you know, becomes active in the Black Power movement in the United States and develops these close ties in Canada and back in the Caribbean, eventually moves to Africa. That's actually not atypical of that political tradition, right? But what Richard's kind of opening into that conversation allows us to think about what happens when we begin to consciously connect those dots, right? Which is tied to a lived experience that just happens anyway, diasporic movement, right? Kind of transcending those national boundaries. What happens when people consciously connect politically and begin to sort of see themselves locally, whether it be in Montreal or in Toronto or in New York, as part of a global movement, right? And I guess extrapolating from that and thinking about the local and the international, I'm kind of posing the question, I'd like to pose a question. So what happens when we begin to kind of think about what's happening in, it could be in Dakar, it could be in, you know, someplace in the Indian subcontinent, wherever it might be. What happens when people who are engaged in the same kinds of struggles on a local level, right, begin to consciously connect, and of course we have the means to do that, and intersect on a kind of global level, right? right? So we talk about global movements often in the abstract, but obviously the global is tied to the international. I mean, the local is tied to the international, right? The local is tied to the global. So what happens when we begin to make those direct connections and begin those direct conversations, right? And understanding the interrelationship between what is happening in a city like Montreal or in London, or what's happening it could be in Buenos Aires, or it could be in Dakar, wherever the case may be. And I think that's part of what he was trying to get us to think about. Because the danger in the absence of that, of course, is that we get tied to national boundaries, and if we're not careful, tied to certain forms of nationalism, in which we can be making demands against forms of oppression in one context and forms of inequality in one context, but not see how the forms of inequality that exist in the United States, for example, are tied to forms of oppression in Iraq, for example, or in other parts of the world. In other words, how the relative affluence that some people experience in the United States is tied to forms of inequality. Right? And then, of course, we get into how the kind of politics of, rather than radically transforming the system, trying to reform it by having a seat at the table, right? So what Richard Eichen was trying to get us to do was think beyond those categories of national boundaries and recognize the limitations of thinking about politics in a purely national way. And in some ways, it's sort of tied to, it's not the same context, and not exactly what Frantz Fanon meant, but it's also tied to, what Fanon referred to the kind of pitfalls of a certain kind of nationalism, right? That is entirely localized. It doesn't think beyond the national boundaries, right? I mean, it's not exactly what he was getting at, but it in a way is a kind of way of seeing it. How do we think beyond national boundaries that allow for a certain kind of internationalism? And I'm going to use the word solidarity, but of course, at a certain point, so if we get beyond notions of solidarity, when we actually understand that we're actually, or at least in theory, fighting for the same thing, in theory. But of course, going back to Richard's first book, race has been a major obstacle in terms of that kind of real, genuine allyship. So the word allyship and allies is being used quite a bit today. But what does it really mean to be an ally? When we have these barriers that have historically prevented folks fighting in terms of common cause.
Thanks, David. Again, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat. We have a query on opening up the discussion, which we can do in the last few minutes of the conversation. We found that conversations online can be a little bit difficult to manage if they're completely decentralized, but in the last few minutes, we'll give our audience the opportunity to ask David some questions too. Okay. Yeah. So David, Cedric Robinson described the Black radical tradition, which we've been alluding to in this conversation, as rooted in the history of Black resistance and an accretion over generations of collective intelligence gathered from struggle. We definitely can't go into the breadth and depth of this political intellectual tradition in a few minutes, but I wondered if you could briefly discuss how this tradition manifested in the 20th century and key moments in its development.
Sure, Cedric Robinson referred to it as a Black radical tradition. We can also refer to it, as a particular manifestation of what we might call the Caribbean radical tradition. And, there are various figures or names that come to mind. Amy Césaire, Claudia Jones, Frantz Fanon, of course, and C.L.R. James. And I'm going to mention James to start with, because I think, going back to something I said earlier, his observation about the history of slavery is very important in terms of understanding this tradition, because he talks about the Haitian Revolution, which ends in 1804, and he talks about the rebellion that becomes a revolution in the North Plain of Haiti, and he describes those slaves, those laborers, and I'm using that language very, very specifically, as being closer to what would have been referred to as the modern proletariat or proletariat in Europe than anything that existed at that time, and that they were working on sugar factories in the North Plain of Haiti. That is James, and Sylvia Winter would do the same much later in our unpublished book, Black Metamorphosis. That is James inserting people of African descent and the history of slavery as part and parcel, as a constituent part of the history of modern capitalism, right? And of course, as a constituent part and a constituted part of modern capitalism, it also means that those revolutions and rebellions that were ever present throughout the Americas are part of the history of the global labor movement and struggle against what would become modern capitalism, right? So James and also Cedric Robertson situate this Black radical tradition within the context and the history of slavery, which of course has been separated historically from the labor movement. Another person that's important to mention within that tradition is Aimé Césaire, because in his book, Discourse on Colonialism, and of course, Césaire at the time was a member of the French Communist Party. He was in the National Assembly as a member of the French Communist Party, representing Martinique, Guadeloupe, and I think Reunion Island too. And one of the things that Césaire repeats in the book Discourse on Colonialism is that we cannot understand capitalism as separate from colonialism. And he was trying to get members of the left, of course, members of the Communist Party, which he eventually resigned from, to understand that you cannot talk about socialism within a context where you're not talking about the plight and circumstances of people living in the colonies. And again, he was making the point that colonialism was a constituent part of capitalism. And of course, these things should sound obvious to us, but these are exactly the kinds of separations that have been made that allowed Western scholars, including members of the Western or white left, right, to foreground the plight and also the struggles of European working class and ignore the conditions of circumstances people living in the colonized world, whether it be in England, whether it be on the African continent, or in the Americas, or in other parts of the world. So at crucial points, people like James, Césaire, and Fanon made crucial interventions, which often fell on deaf ears in terms of trying to really understand the world that we live in and how it functions. And part of that, of course, meant trying to decenter this incessant emphasis on Europe as a locus of capitalism, and therefore as a locus of anti-capitalist struggle, when in fact those struggles in the form of anti-colonial struggles and prior to that anti-slavery struggles, right, were ongoing and a crucial part of that ongoing struggle. The other person that's important to mention here is Claudia Jones. And Claudia Jones is important for a number of reasons. She came from Trinidad like C.L.R. James, was a member of the US Communist Party in the 1940s and 50s, and as a Black woman made significant contributions in terms of thinking about the relationship not only between race and class, but race, class, and gender, right? So what is often referred to as intersectionality today, kind of language that is taken for granted. Claudia Jones was amongst the first to kind of, without using that word, to kind of trying to get, and a part of it was in response to trying to get her associates within the Communist Party to think about race and take race seriously, as opposed to, again, the incessant focus on the working class, which of course, when the generic leftists talked, as I already mentioned, I know it sounds repetitive, when the generic leftists talked about working class politics, it usually excludes people of African descent, right? Even in Western societies. So not even just talking about in the parts of the world that were colonized, we're not just talking about in the Caribbean or Africa, but even in the North American context, when you're actually literally talking about African-American workers, they've historically been excluded from that category. In other words, that category remains white as a vestige of those codes that were associated with colonialism when slavery was moved out of the conversation in relation to labor. So, the Black radical tradition, even when it has not explicitly historically spoken about socialism, has been involved in this conversation about socialism, right? But of course, going back to the point I made earlier in terms of Richard Eichen, the problem has historically been that, you know, a Black radical tradition exists in response to its white counterpart, precisely because of that barrier of race or anti-Black racism, right? Which is of course tied to racial capitalism. The last thing I guess I would say about that tradition is that, like, you know, if we're really talking about trying to understand the world that we want to live in order to change it, right? The Caribbean and Black radical tradition has been a more complete assessment, or has represented a more complete assessment of the world in which we live in, right? Because it's tied to not only local context, right, or local notions of struggle related to workers, related to labor, but again, going back to Richard Eichen's notion of diaspora in the political sense, right? It's part of an internationalist struggle. And it's also part of a struggle that takes into consideration, even though it's often been weak on gender, takes into consideration the kind of totality of a human experience, which is a lived experience, you know, which is racialized. And white folks are racialized too, right? In a different sense, because the other side of anti-Black racism is the existence of white privilege, right? So what the Black radical tradition tried to do as a kind of autonomous tradition is try to get us think beyond, you know, these kind of universal categories that have historically excluded people of African descent, politically, socially, and even culturally.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, David. Before we get to some of the questions coming through in the chat, in Moving Against the System, which is a collection of speeches from the 1968 Congress of Black writers held in Montreal, Stokely Carmichael was the keynote speaker at that conference, and Carmichael and many other African-American intellectuals have spoken about the unwillingness to confront racism in left-wing movements, which you've also discussed. In the UK today, people of color on the left have often expressed a sense of exclusion in spaces that should be their political home. I wondered if you could say a few words on the responsibility of the left to address racism within our movements in a way that isn't tokenistic.
Sure, well, I guess we begin that conversation by saying that, well, ideally, and I realize there's theory and practice, when we're talking about the left, right, it should automatically be inclusive of people of African descent who are on the left, right? But because of the bifurcation that exists for all the reasons I mentioned before, there's this historic separation, right? So we talk about the white left, right, which then passes for the left in general, and then there's everything else that other folks do, right? So we look at the history of the 1960s, for example, as an explosion of kind of the new left, right? That is historically separated in terms of the narrative from the civil rights Black Power movement, right? Which was a kind of crucial centerpiece of that entire moment and that entire historical period, just as an example. So, you know, it's interesting that we're still having this conversation today, but, you know, generally speaking, the left has failed to understand the dynamics of race and how race intersects with class, right? And this is, you know, the reason why such a thing as a Black radical tradition exists, as I said earlier, is precisely because of that lack of understanding and because of that absence. And it goes back to a certain kind of fixation on the left with we'll say a Marxian analysis, right? Which I think, to give Marx credit, cannot be entirely blamed on him, right? Because we look at the totality of some of Marx's writing, right, in the Grundis and other works, right? Clearly, he had a preoccupation with what was happening in the United States. And he understood what was happening in the United States in relation to slavery. He had somewhat of a preoccupation in terms of understanding the colonial world in relation to capitalism, despite his point of emphasis. But what has happened amongst the left, particularly those who are influenced by a certain version of Marxism, is that that emphasis has become the thing itself. It has become the kind of outlook or approach or methodology of the left itself, to the exclusion of the struggles that are being waged throughout the world. And you know, the thing I always find interesting and even somewhat ironic, I'll use the Caribbean as an example, on how the Cold War impacted places like Jamaica, where, you know, we saw attempts, well, successful attempts actually, to destabilize the socialistic government of Michael Manley in the 1970s and 80s by the United States. We saw the Workers' Party of Jamaica, you know, for all of its problems, issues, and failings, right, played somewhat of a role in the context of Jamaica and the wider Caribbean. We saw the Grenada Revolution of an island of 100,000 people, right, which became a source of inspiration on the global stage, because it engaged in this kind of experiment with socialism, even though it only lasted 4 years. If we look around Latin America, the Caribbean, not to mention the African continent, whether it be in Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Tanzania. My point is that in those parts of the world, right, despite the supposed centrality of the left in Europe and the United States, particularly in Europe, the white left, right, people of African descent, and also people in the Indian subcontinent and in Asia, have actually more direct experience, if we forget about Eastern Europe for a second, so we're talking about Western Europe, right, have more direct experience with this thing called socialism and the direct implications of left politics, socialism, etc., than most of the ideologues in Western Europe and North America who've had a theoretical experience with it, right? And yet that experience continues to be marginalized, right, in this kind of center-periphery analysis, right? And of course, the center-periphery is racialized, right, because there's no part of Europe that's on this periphery, right? There's no part where there are people of European origins that are on this periphery. So I think that until the generic left, which is a kind of euphemism for the white left, right, has the humility to learn from the experiences of other groups of people and understand the relationship between those experiences and their own, right, there's always going to be this kind of obstacle to you know, I mean, there's going to be this obstacle to kind of genuine solidarity. I mean, I take the example in the UK, for example, because you know, because I've written about the poet Linton Kwesi Johnson, who was a member of the Race Today collective. Most of the time, and Pluto just recently published a book about the Race Today collective, which includes many of the kind of a number of articles, et cetera, that were published in the journal. And you know, it never fails. It never ceases to amaze me that the Race Today collective is consistently referred to as one of the most important Black organizations in the UK. Now, when you look through the pages of the journal and also understand the history of the organization, clearly it was one of the most important organizations, Black or white, in the UK during that period, you know, between the early 1970s through to the 1980s. But that's persistently what happens with Black political organizing, right? In the US, it takes another form. Black Power, Black Panther Party, League of Revolution Black Workers, those organizations that kind of function in that broad kind of left Black political tradition, right? They're spoken about separately as if they were not integral and in fact even inspirational to movements that came out either after them or functioned alongside them. And until we're able to, you know, and I don't want to sound patronizing, but I'm saying this like genuinely, until members of the white left, generally speaking, are able to kind of overcome and understand that unwillingness or inability to kind of see those movements for what they are is explicitly tied to race, right? And also that those movements have been crucial in terms of confronting the very same institutional structural problems tied to modern capitalism that members of the left also purport to be struggling against. Until there's that understanding, right? They're at a loss, right? They're at a loss. And what we're seeing in the streets today is that Black folks are not waiting for people to catch up, right? They're pushing forward and pushing the conversation forward. And to go back to where we started at the beginning, it's like, you know, I cannot think of another time in my lifetime when there's been this level of conversation about the convergence of race and class. Now, some of it is not entirely talking about like the intricacies of the structural problem. We need to have more conversation about that, right? But just hearing the level of conversation and where it's been pushed to, these conversations could not have had the same kind of publicity and take up the same kind of space just 3 weeks ago, never mind 3 years ago, as I was saying earlier. So, you know, the conversation is being pushed ahead. The question becomes like, where does the white left situate itself within that conversation? And how willing is the humility there and the level of openness and understanding there to be able to be part of that conversation?
Thanks, David. I think that's a really, really important point. So we've spoken quite a bit about the past, and I also wanted to speak a bit about visions for the future. We know that those whose voices are on the margins are less attached to the status quo and the way that things are right now, and so their vision for tomorrow is not as bounded as those in the center. So commenting on the radical and disruptive work of Black feminists, Gail Lewis describes how from the margins it's possible to see across an entire field of vision, whereas from the center one has to keep turning in circles, which I think is a nice way to put it. I'd love to hear what you think about this, and in your opinion, what the future that we want looks like, and how we fight for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a huge question. It's a big question, and you know, so I wrote a book called Dread Poetry and Freedom, which came out 2 years ago, and in many ways, the reason why I wrote that book was a way of trying to think beyond the pessimism of the present. And that present actually began in 2001, because that's when I began writing it in the post 9/11 period. And to kind of pose a question like, how do we imagine possibilities beyond our present conjuncture? And of course, so like we're living in a world in which, you know, we think about politics, and I'm a big believer in learning for the past. In fact, I think that I understand history not as something that just happened in the past, but as a methodology, a way of thinking through the same questions that we're posing today, but through the past, and sort of trying to see what can we learn from past experience, successes and failures, right? In terms of, you know, just in terms of politics in general, whether it converted race, class, you know, gender, you know, sexuality, and like the failings of previous generations to deal with some of these questions adequately. So I think history is an important point of departure in terms of understanding the present, because we think about the past through the prism, through the eyes of the present. We pose questions about the past because we want to understand those questions today. At least I think that's, you know, that's the way that history best serves us. But the reason why I wrote Dread Poetry and Freedom was not only because I think history is important, but more than thinking that history is important, is to kind of explore the way in which art and artists and poets, so it focuses particularly on a poet, Linton Kwesi Johnson, who many of you know, but it's really like through his poetry to think about a tradition of poetry that is tied to politics, influenced by figures like Aimé Césaire, who we mentioned earlier, as both a political figure and also a poet. People like C.L.R. James, who has been described as an artist, as revolutionary. People like Suzanne Césaire, who was part of the Surrealist movement, or, you know, or a particular brand of Surrealism that she, alongside Césaire and others, developed in Martinique, right? But the whole point is that art and poetry allows us to think beyond our moment. It allows us to kind of step outside of ourselves and to imagine different possibilities. And it's not coincidental that various thinkers whose work we might respect, aside from those that I just mentioned, Marx himself, Karl Polanyi and others, right, were keen observers of art and literature. In one instance, in those two instances, particularly Shakespeare, because they realized that artists have this kind of creative capacity to allow us to step outside our particular moment and project towards the future, right? Or project towards a world beyond our immediate existence. So I like to think, and Robin Kelly has talked about this in the book Freedom Dreams, right? Where he talks about people like Thelonious Monk. Art allows us again to think beyond the present, and that we need, as people who are concerned about politics, right, to develop that kind of creative capacity that artists exercise in their daily lives to think about politics in a different way. In other words, we've been reduced to thinking about politics in terms of conventional politics as they exist. And even for those of us who might, for people who might see themselves as socialists, whatever the case may be, right? But there are certain models within those traditions that clearly are outmoded, right? So how do we kind of draw on that kind of artistic and poetic imagination, right, to allow us to think and imagine new ways of doing politics that are more in concert with our time? So that's on the level of consciousness. But of course, clearly change doesn't come without people organizing, right? And we're in this moment that's inspirational in terms of the kind of conversations that are taking place, right? But it's the day-to-day organizing that makes that kind of difference. With a vision towards the future, with a vision towards like seeing other possibilities. And when we combine those elements with what I was saying earlier about the importance of acting locally, but thinking internationally and having those conscious connections with groups and organizations and movements that are doing work in other local contexts, which is what makes an international movement, kind of grounded in local experience. If we begin to think in that direction, I think it has a capacity to take us kind of beyond where we are today. I mean, the last thing I will say is that those conversations, just to go back to something we mentioned, we don't have enough conversations about the intricacies of this system and how it functions. Like we still talk about race on one hand, class on the other hand, etc., as opposed to understanding how they intersect. Right? We don't have a critical. I'm saying we. I don't think the language has been broad enough in terms of thinking about the structural inequalities that are embedded in the system that we live in, right? Politically and economically. So I think the combination of those elements, I think, and especially in a moment like this where there's an opening and people are open to listening and learning, it seems, right? The combination of those factors, I think, will allow us to kind of think and imagine beyond the present and to think and imagine, what kinds of actions in our daily lives and our political lives would bring us to that point. But the critique itself is very important, but it also involves going beyond critique.